Argentina's banner row, the full story behind the visa dispute with England. Some football rivalries are born on the pitch, through close scorelines, fierce tackles, legendary goals. And then there are rivalries that reach far beyond the pitch, woven deep into the history of two nations, flaring up every time Argentina and England meet. That's exactly what's happened over the past few days. A football match has reignited a decades-old diplomatic dispute, and suddenly it's not just sports journalists talking about it. British government officials, security analysts, and immigration lawyers are weighing in too. In this in-depth breakdown, we'll cover every angle of this story: what actually happened, why Britain is so sensitive to a simple banner, what legal options the UK government genuinely has, how FIFA has handled similar cases in the past, and what all of this means for the players and clubs involved. We're taking the time to cover this story fully and factually, without exaggeration, but without downplaying the scale of the controversy either. Chapter 1: What actually happened? The trigger for this entire story was a World Cup semi-final between Argentina and England, which Argentina won 2-1 to secure their place in the final. On the pitch, it was a gripping match, intense, physical, with several turning points. But what happened after the final whistle ended up overshadowing even Argentina's sporting achievement. During the victory celebrations, players Lisandro Martinez and Giovanni Lo Celso held up a banner reading, in large letters, "Las Malvinas son Argentinas, the Falkland Islands belong to Argentina." Photos and videos of the moment spread across social media within minutes, and before the players had even reached the locker room, the topic was already dominating British newsrooms. It's worth understanding, this banner isn't a new phenomenon. It has appeared regularly at Argentine national team matches for years, generally as an expression of a patriotic sentiment deeply rooted in the country. But the timing, right after a win over England, in an emotionally charged tournament moment, gave the gesture a very different kind of weight this time. Chapter 2: Why the Falkland Islands are such a sensitive topic. To understand why a simple piece of fabric with 4 words could trigger such a political reaction, it helps to look at the history of the Falkland Islands, a chapter that carries fundamentally different meanings for Britons and Argentines. The Falkland Islands, known in Spanish as Islas Malvinas, sit in the South Atlantic, roughly 400 miles off the Argentine coast. The island group was claimed by various European powers over the centuries. British sailors are believed to have sighted and partially settled the islands as early as the 16th and 17th centuries. France and Spain also established settlements at various points. After Argentina's independence from Spain in 1816, the country declared sovereignty over the islands in 1820. In 1833, however, Britain took control of the Falklands and established a permanent presence that continues to this day. The vast majority of today's islanders are of British descent and clearly identify as British. Argentina, meanwhile, has never abandoned its sovereignty claim and views British control as the continuation of a historical injustice comparable, in the Argentine framing, to a colonial occupation that persists into the present. This dispute, more than 150 years old, escalated into open military conflict in 1982. Argentina's ruling military junta at the time, under General Leopoldo Galtieri, was mired in a deep domestic crisis, economic stagnation, high unemployment, and growing resistance to a military government that had held power since a 1976 coup and stood accused of severe human rights abuses. Hoping to stir patriotic sentiment and shore up its own grip on power, Galtieri ordered the invasion of the Falkland Islands on April 2, 1982. Argentine forces overwhelmed the small garrison of British Marines stationed in the island capital, Stanley, with little resistance. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, however, responded decisively. She dispatched a naval task force of more than 30 warships on an approximately 8,000-mile journey to the South Atlantic to retake the islands. The war that followed lasted 74 days, from April 2 to June 14, 1982. According to consistent historical sources, it claimed roughly 649 Argentine and between 255 and 257 British lives, along with 3 civilian deaths on the islands themselves. Among the most defining and controversial moments of the war was the sinking of the Argentine cruiser General Belgrano by a British submarine on May 2, killing 323 Argentine sailors, the single greatest loss of life in the entire conflict. On the British side, the loss of the destroyer HMS Sheffield to an Argentine Exocet missile shocked the home front, as it was the first Royal Navy vessel sunk by enemy action since the Second World War. On June 14, 1982, Argentine forces on the islands surrendered. The war had far-reaching political consequences. In Britain, the victory significantly strengthened Margaret Thatcher's political standing and is still regarded today as one of the defining moments of her premiership. In Argentina, on the other hand, the defeat accelerated the collapse of the military junta. General Galtieri was removed from power by his own government just days after the surrender, ultimately paving the way for the country's return to democracy. To this day, the question of sovereignty remains unresolved. The United Nations called on both sides to negotiate as early as 1965 through a resolution, but genuine progress never materialized. A 2013 referendum among the islanders produced an overwhelming majority in favor of remaining a British overseas territory, a result Argentina does not recognize as binding, since it disputes the legitimacy of today's island population as descendants of British settlers. For many Britons, the memory of the soldiers who died in 1982 remains vivid. Memorial services, war monuments, and annual ceremonies keep the topic alive. For many Argentines, meanwhile, the claim to Las Malvinas is a core part of national identity, regularly invoked in school textbooks, public speeches, and, as we've seen, in sport. It's this dual emotional weight that explains why a piece of fabric bearing 4 words could provoke such a strong reaction. Chapter 3: The Reaction in Britain. The moment images of the celebration surfaced, British media and social networks erupted. Both tabloids and broadsheet newspapers covered the incident extensively, and a heated debate developed across social media within hours. The most prominent voice belonged to Niall Gardiner, a former foreign policy aide to Margaret Thatcher who also helped write her final book, Statecraft. Gardiner posted very pointedly on X, calling for every Argentine player in the Premier League who took part in the display to have their UK work visa revoked. He described it as an ugly anti-British display and called for zero tolerance toward such conduct. That demand resonated with a segment of the public. Fan forums, newspaper comment sections, and social media threads filled with voices calling for a tough response from British authorities. For many fans, the message was clear: players earning high salaries in England and benefiting from the prestige of the Premier League should refrain from political provocations aimed at their host country. At the same time, there were also more measured voices pointing out that the banner was primarily an expression of national identity, comparable to gestures made by other national teams in different political contexts, and that a response as drastic as visa revocation would be wildly disproportionate to the act itself. Chapter 4: The UK government's official position. While the public debate raged, the British government took a noticeably more restrained stance. Business Secretary Peter Kyle addressed the incident and called the players' conduct entirely inappropriate. At the same time, however, he made clear that in his view, politics and football needed to remain separate, and that the matter fell under FIFA's jurisdiction, not that of UK immigration authorities. This statement was notable because it marked a clear gap between the emotional public reaction and the government's actual course of action. The government explicitly chose not to escalate the matter on a diplomatic or immigration level, even though public pressure to do so was substantial. This restraint can also be read politically. Direct government intervention in a sporting matter, especially through immigration tools, would have set a far-reaching precedent, not just for football but for the broader sports and cultural sector, where foreign nationals live and work across Britain. Chapter 5: What UK visa law actually allows. A central question in this whole debate is whether the British government would even have the legal grounds to revoke the players' work visas. That question is worth examining more closely through the lens of UK immigration law. The Home Office does, in fact, possess a tool that could theoretically apply here, the so-called conducive to the public good provision. This allows authorities to revoke a visa or deny entry when a person's presence is deemed harmful to the public interest. However, immigration law experts consistently emphasize that this provision is applied in practice almost exclusively in cases involving national security, terrorism, serious organized crime, or extremist incitement. It's a tool designed for serious threats, not for controversial, yet fundamentally legal, political expression. A political banner, however controversial and painful it may feel to a segment of the British public, does not, according to legal experts, generally meet the criteria for such action. Speech, even speech many find offensive, enjoys strong protection in liberal democracies like Britain, as long as it doesn't incite violence or constitute a concrete threat. There's also a practical dimension. Taking action against the players would likely trigger intense legal challenges with an uncertain outcome and significant media and diplomatic fallout. Many observers see this as precisely why the government prefers to leave the matter to FIFA rather than act itself. Chapter 6: FIFA's role. If not the British government, then who actually decides on potential consequences? The answer lies within international football itself, specifically, FIFA's disciplinary committee. FIFA's Code of Conduct for stadiums and international competitions explicitly bans political, offensive, or discriminatory messages inside stadiums and in the immediate vicinity of matches. The relevant provision here is Article 34.3 of FIFA's regulations, which addresses the prevention of provocative and aggressive actions and places responsibility on national federations for their players' conduct. Following the incident, FIFA confirmed that its disciplinary committee is reviewing match reports and available video footage to determine whether a rule violation occurred. Such a proceeding follows a clearly defined process. First, officials assess whether there's sufficient evidence of a possible violation. The Argentine Football Association, AFA, is then given the opportunity to formally respond. Only after that does the committee decide on any potential sanction. Chapter 7: Looking back, the 2014 precedent. This situation is far from new territory for Argentina and FIFA. Back in June 2014, just days before the World Cup in Brazil, an almost identical incident made headlines. Ahead of a friendly against Slovenia in La Plata, the Argentine national team posed with the exact same banner, Las Malvinas son Argentinas, in front of roughly 52,000 spectators. FIFA opened an investigation into an apparent breach of the rules on preventing provocative actions. At the end of the process, the Argentine Federation was fined roughly £20,000, around 30,000 Swiss francs at the time. Notably, it wasn't the only fine the Federation received that month. A much larger fine of £200,000 had already been imposed for failing to bring players to mandatory pre-World Cup press conferences. This precedent matters a great deal for the current situation. It shows that FIFA has acted in comparable cases before, but with a fine against the federation, not sanctions against individual players, and certainly not measures affecting their work or residency status in another country. If FIFA reaches a similar conclusion this time, another fine against the Argentine Federation is the most likely outcome, not a ban on individual players, let alone action against their status in the UK. Chapter 8: Profiles of the players involved. Let's take a closer look at the players whose names come up most frequently in this controversy. Lisandro Martinez, Manchester United centre-back, was among the players directly holding the banner. The Argentine international has established himself since his move to England as one of the league's most uncompromising defenders, known for his tenacity in duels despite his relatively modest height. His visible role in the banner moment makes him a central figure in the public debate. Giovanni Lo Celso, who held the other end of the banner, has most recently been linked with Tottenham Hotspur, after previously playing for several other European clubs. A technically gifted midfielder, he's held in high regard in Argentina and now finds himself under increased scrutiny in Britain as a result of this incident. Enzo Fernandez, Chelsea midfielder, is also frequently named in coverage, though different sources describe his exact level of direct involvement in the banner moment differently. Since his big-money move to Chelsea, Fernandez has become one of the most recognizable Argentine players in the Premier League, and a 2022 World Cup hero. Christian Romero, Tottenham Hotspur centre-back, is regarded as one of the most aggressive and physically uncompromising defenders of his generation. His name regularly comes up in discussions about pushing the limits on the pitch, which adds further attention to his role in this controversy. Leandro Paredes, who currently plays outside the Premier League, is also mentioned in connection with this story, having historically been linked to several controversial moments involving the Argentine national team. It's worth noting, none of the Premier League clubs named Manchester United, Chelsea, or Tottenham Hotspur have issued an official statement on the incident so far. That means none of these clubs have publicly distanced themselves from or defended their players, a wait-and-see approach that isn't surprising given the unclear legal and disciplinary situation. Chapter 9: Historical Context. Argentina vs. England on the pitch. To fully grasp the emotional intensity of this incident, it also helps to look at the long history of footballing rivalry between Argentina and England, which extends well beyond the current controversy. Perhaps the most famous chapter of this rivalry comes from the 1986 World Cup quarter-final in Mexico, just 4 years after the Falklands War. In that match, Diego Maradona scored two of the most famous goals in football history, first the infamous Hand of God goal, in which he punched the ball into the net unnoticed by the referee, and just minutes later a solo goal widely regarded by experts as one of the greatest of all time. Maradona later described the first goal with a phrase that became legendary, an allusion to divine intervention rather than deliberate intent. Argentina won the match and went on to become world champions. For many Argentines, that victory symbolized a kind of sporting vindication following the military defeat of 1982, a connection historians and sports journalists have repeatedly explored. The 1998 World Cup in France also produced a headline-grabbing clash between the two teams. David Beckham was sent off after kicking out at Diego Simeone, and England were eliminated on penalties. Beckham faced months of public criticism in England afterward and only restored his public standing years later, most notably through his decisive goal against the same Argentine side at the 2002 World Cup. These examples show that every Argentina-England encounter carries an extra layer of symbolic weight that goes well beyond the sporting contest itself. It's this historically accumulated charge that explains why a banner that would barely have made international headlines against another opponent triggered such a fierce reaction in the context of a match against England. Chapter 10, Politics and Sport: A Recurring Conflict. The current incident fits into a long history of clashes between politics and sport. International sporting bodies like FIFA or the International Olympic Committee have traditionally maintained that sporting venues should be politically neutral spaces, a position enshrined in numerous rulebooks but repeatedly tested in practice. Athletes throughout history have carried political messages into sport, from symbolic gestures at medal ceremonies to messages on jerseys or banners, as in this case. Such moments regularly spark debate over where the line lies between legitimate expression and inappropriate politicization of sport, a debate that rarely reaches a clear, universally accepted consensus, and instead usually depends on the observer's own political and cultural perspective. In the specific case of the Falklands, there's an added complication. This isn't a general political statement, but a territorial claim directed specifically at a host country where the players in question work and earn their living professionally. It's precisely this combination, economic dependence on the host country paired with a political statement directed against that same country, that has made the debate in Britain particularly charged. Chapter 11, The Club's Perspective. From a financial standpoint, the Premier League clubs involved find themselves in an awkward position. Manchester United, Chelsea, and Tottenham Hotspur have invested substantial sums in their Argentine players in recent years, transfer fees that in some cases run into the hundreds of millions, combined with high wages and long-term contracts. Should one of the more drastic scenarios actually materialize, such as restrictions on residency status, should the legal landscape shift in the future, the financial and sporting consequences for these clubs would be significant. As outlined in earlier chapters, however, such a scenario currently appears legally unlikely. From a PR standpoint, the clubs still face a difficult balancing act. Showing too much public support for their players risks criticism from parts of their own fanbase, while publicly distancing themselves could be seen as abandoning their own players. This dilemma likely explains why none of the clubs have issued an official statement so far, a wait-and-see communications approach until there's more clarity on the actual disciplinary consequences. Chapter 12, What Happens Next? Based on what's currently known, several realistic scenarios can be sketched out for how this story develops, though it's worth stressing these are assessments based on past precedent, not confirmed outcomes. The most likely scenario, supported by the 2014 precedent, is a fine against the Argentine Football Association handed down by FIFA's disciplinary committee, possibly combined with an official warning about future conduct at international tournaments. A second, considerably less likely scenario would be individual sanctions against specific players, such as a suspension for one or more international matches, a tool FIFA has used in the past for other code of conduct violations, though rarely for this type of political expression. A third scenario, the least legally plausible but the most politically discussed, would be actual intervention by UK immigration authorities. As outlined in Chapter 5, such a step would likely face significant legal hurdles and would be difficult to sustain without a considerably more serious incident. The most probable outcome, then, is that this story will fade from headlines over the coming weeks once FIFA announces its decision, most likely in the form of a fine, and that the players involved will continue their Premier League careers without immediate legal consequences. The broader political debate over the Falklands itself, however, will remain untouched and will very likely resurface the next time the two national teams meet. Chapter 13, The Broader Social Dimension. Beyond the purely sporting and legal aspects, this incident also raises more fundamental questions. How should professional athletes handle their platform when it comes to issues that extend far beyond sport? Where's the line between a legitimate expression of national identity and an unnecessary provocation of a host country? And what responsibility do bodies like FIFA bear in enforcing clear, consistent rules rather than reacting differently case by case? These questions don't have definitive answers, and that's exactly what makes this story so compelling to many observers. It touches on themes like national identity, colonial history, economic migration, and the role of sport as a global stage where all these threads come together. Chapter 14, How a FIFA disciplinary proceeding actually works. To set realistic expectations for the ongoing process, it's worth taking a closer look at how a FIFA disciplinary proceeding formally unfolds. This process follows fixed, often multi-week steps and rarely produces immediate results. In the first step, FIFA gathers all available evidence, official referee reports, stadium camera footage, photos from accredited media, and, where relevant, additional footage supplied by spectators or broadcasters. This body of material forms the basis for further review. In the second step, an investigator with the disciplinary committee assesses whether there's sufficient basis for a possible rule violation. Only once that threshold is met is a formal proceeding opened and the relevant national federation, in this case, the Asociación del Fútbol Argentino, AFA, officially notified. In the third step, the federation in question is given the opportunity to respond in writing. That response might provide context, cite mitigating circumstances, or reject the allegations outright. In similar past cases, the AFA has argued that displaying the banner was an expression of cultural and national identity rather than a targeted provocation against specific individuals. Only after reviewing all submitted materials does the disciplinary committee reach a decision. Possible sanctions range from an official warning, through fines of varying amounts, up to, in more serious cases, suspensions of individuals or even spectator restrictions at future matches in specific stadium sections. Which sanction is ultimately applied depends heavily on the committee's discretion and on precedent, which is why the 2014 case plays such an important role in the current analysis. It's also worth noting that decisions by the disciplinary committee can generally be appealed to FIFA's appeal committee, and as a final step, the matter can be brought before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, CAS, in Lausanne. That means even an initial ruling isn't necessarily the last word on the matter. The entire process can stretch out over months. Chapter 15, Political Messages in Sport, Further Historical Examples. The current incident is far from the only example of political messages making their way into sport. Looking at comparable historical moments helps put the present situation into perspective and shows just how differently governing bodies and governments have reacted to such incidents. At the 1968 Olympics in Mexico City, American sprinters Tommy Smith and John Carlos drew worldwide attention with a silent, raised fist gesture during the medal ceremony, understood as a symbol of the American civil rights movement. The International Olympic Committee responded at the time by immediately expelling both athletes from the Olympic Village, a considerably harsher and swifter reaction than anything seen so far from FIFA or British authorities in the current case. In American football, starting in 2016, Colin Kaepernick's gesture of kneeling during the national anthem to protest racism and police violence became, over several years, one of the biggest political controversies in the history of U.S. sport. The debate reached the highest levels of American politics and demonstrated how powerfully a single symbolic gesture can expose deep societal divides. European football, too, has repeatedly seen political messages spark controversy at international matches in connection with Kashmir, Catalonia, or Kosovo, for instance, with different federations responding with varying degrees of severity. These examples make clear that there's no single, globally consistent standard for how political messages in sport are sanctioned. FIFA and other governing bodies tend to decide on a case-by-case basis, which in turn draws criticism for a lack of consistency. Chapter 16, What the Falklands Mean to the Argentine Public Today. To understand why Argentine players display such a banner in the first place, it's worth looking at how significant the issue still is within Argentine society today. The claim to Las Malvinas isn't confined to any one political faction in Argentina, it's shared across the political spectrum and is explicitly enshrined in the Argentine constitution. April 2nd, the anniversary of the 1982 invasion, is observed in Argentina as the Day of the Veterans and the Fallen of the Malvinas War, an official holiday marked by nationwide commemorations. The topic is a fixed part of the history curriculum in Argentine schools, and public buildings, street signs, and even maps frequently make explicit reference to Argentina's sovereignty claim. For many Argentines, regardless of political affiliation, this is a matter of national dignity and historical justice, not a footnote of foreign policy. That deep societal grounding explains why Argentine national players keep returning to the subject in emotionally charged moments, like a tournament win over England of all opponents. From their perspective, it isn't a targeted provocation, but the expression of a sentiment that enjoys broad social consensus back home. Chapter 17, The Economic Dimension: What's at Stake? Should drastic consequences for individual players actually materialize against expectations, the economic fallout would be substantial both for the players themselves and for their clubs and the Premier League as a whole. The Premier League is widely regarded as the most commercially successful football league in the world, in part due to its international star power. Argentine players have accounted for a growing share of that international appeal in recent years, not least because of the 2022 World Cup title and the global attention it brought to Argentine football. A forced departure of several high-profile Argentine players within a short period would not only leave sporting gaps at the clubs involved, but would also mean significant financial losses, both through missed sporting success and the need to sell players under time pressure, potentially below market value. Such scenarios are discussed in trade press coverage, but as outlined in earlier chapters, they're considered unlikely given the current legal landscape. Chapter 18, Frequently Asked Questions. Has any visa actually been revoked so far? No. So far this is purely a public demand from individual commentators, not a government action. Has FIFA already reached a final decision? No. The disciplinary committee is reviewing the case, a decision is still pending. Have the clubs involved commented officially? Not so far. Is there a comparable precedent? Yes, 2014, which resulted in a fine against the Argentine Federation. Conclusion. What began with a simple banner after a football match has grown into a multi-layered debate weaving together history, law, politics, and sport. The facts we know today paint a clearer picture than the initial headlines suggested. The British government has explicitly ruled out immigration intervention, the legal bar for visa revocation is high, and FIFA already has a well-established precedent from 2014 for handling situations like this. Even so, the emotional weight of this story is undeniable. It touches a wound that hasn't fully healed in over 4 decades, and it shows once again just how tightly sport, history, and national identity can be intertwined. We'll keep following this story closely and update you as soon as FIFA reaches an official decision or new developments emerge. Until then, subscribe, turn on notifications, and let us know in the comments how you see this story, a legitimate expression of national identity, or an unnecessary provocation of a host nation. See you next time.